Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone out there joining from Africa, the US, different parts of the world. Great to have everyone with us. We had about 300 people signed up. So thank you for taking the time to join us and our great group of panelists and speakers from across Africa. My name's Fred Nelson. I'm the CEO of Mali Asili. For those of you who don't know us, Mali Asili is an organization dedicated to supporting and strengthening the leading conservation organizations in Africa and Madagascar. We work across 5 countries now, and we're privileged to work with some of the top African conservation leaders and organizations, including this group joining us today. So this webinar is on community-based conservation and what's happening with community-based conservation around Africa this year in this very strange and unusual and challenging and difficult and at times fascinating year. Really all of the partners and the organizations we support are working in community-based conservation. Working with communities and making conservation work at the local level is critical to the future of wildlife and wildlands and local communities, livelihoods, and economic opportunities as well across Africa. And this year has brought a lot of new challenges, as well as a lot of really dynamic responses and ideas around solutions. And what we really want to do with this session is take a broad scan across looking at 4 countries, 4 critical countries: Kenya, Tanzania, Namibia, Zambia, where some of the most important conservation work and initiatives are going on, and look at what's been happening. What's the situation? What challenges are some of the key organizations and conservationists facing on the ground? And how are they responding? And what are we learning from that? And really, what are we learning about the future of conservation in Africa as well from this unique crisis that everyone has had to confront? And we've realized, we've been working with our partners since the beginning of the pandemic to help them respond, to help them deal with these unusual challenges at the field level or with fundraising. And to confront challenges relating to loss of revenue from tourism, which we'll be hearing a lot about. And 6 months in, I think there's been a lot of innovation. There's been a lot of real creative and dedicated responses at different levels. And so again, we want to try to capture some of that and create an opportunity for a conversation as well amongst a diverse group of African conservation leaders who I'll introduce in just a moment as we get going with the panel. Just a couple of logistical notes on the session. So a number of you have already introduced yourself in the chat. We've got the chat for asking questions to the panel. I'll be moderating throughout, but we've got a Mali Asili team working behind the scenes to help distill some of the key questions and themes. So feel free to put your questions to the panelists in the chat. If there are kind of specific questions, some of our team members may answer them directly, but otherwise I'll kind of incorporate them into the ongoing conversation. And also the session will be recorded, so it will also be available to share, and we'll post those details on social media and through some communication channels. So before we turn to the speakers and start hearing about what's happening at the national level and the local level in responding to challenges and developing solutions on community-based conservation, I want to just set the context a little bit. As I said, community conservation is really critical for the future of wildlife, of landscapes, of conservation efforts in Africa. And of course, a lot of focus in the media right now on the biodiversity crisis, on thinking about future conservation policies at a global level, and an increasing recognition around the world that indigenous people and local communities are absolutely critical to scaling up conservation efforts, meeting the current crisis, and stepping up to the challenges that we're all facing everywhere in the world. In Africa, this is particularly the case, where local livelihoods, local land use, local management systems, and conservation efforts are so closely interconnected. About 80% of land across all of Africa is customary communal land. And in a lot of countries, that's where most wildlife and biodiversity is found. We'll be hearing about efforts at the local level and the national level in Kenya. And an often cited statistic in Kenya is, that about 65-70% of Kenya's wildlife is found outside of protected areas on community and private lands in places like the Masai Mara, part of the Serengeti ecosystem, one of the most famous wildlife areas in the world. The 1 million+ wildebeest and zebra that migrate up to the Masai Mara in Kenya at this time of year in the dry season, most of those animals are outside the Mara Reserve and on private community conservancies, which have become increasingly important for conservation in that region. So Tanzania, Namibia, areas that have these big wildlife systems, the future of wildlife is really reliant on community lands and how communities feel about conservation and whether it's in their interest to support conservation efforts. That also goes for providing connectivity for protected areas. So when we talk about protected areas and we talk about community-based conservation, it's two sides of the coin. They both have to work and they're both interconnected in these big landscapes with a range of different types of management areas. One of the most important trends in Africa, and a basis for Malia Sili's work and that of all of our partners, has been really, I think, a lot of innovation and progress in community conservation in a lot of places. Particularly in Namibia and Kenya, two countries that have really taken community conservation to scale. In Namibia today, there's 170,000 square kilometers, about 40 million acres, or 20% of the country, in communal conservancies that have been developed since the late 1990s, and a set of pioneering reforms to enable and empower communities to have greater rights to manage and benefit wildlife. And Namibia has really become a pioneer globally, with over 40% of its total land area in protected areas, private conservancies, and communal conservancies. That's the kind of impact at scale that we need, and we need to be thinking about on a global level if we want to scale up conservation efforts. Similar progress in Kenya more recently over the past decade, with a very dynamic conservancies movement that's now helping to protect about 11% of the country. So again, doubling the area under conservation management in Kenya and Namibia. Now, within that context, the current challenge that we're facing, a lot of this progress, a lot of the expansion of protected areas and community conservation initiatives has been driven by wildlife tourism. Wildlife is a unique economic asset for Africa, and countries have invested in conservation partly because of that value. And one of the obvious and major and widely publicized impacts that we faced this year has been the loss of international travel and tourism, and billions and billions of dollars of income and millions of jobs in countries like Kenya and Tanzania and Namibia and South Africa and elsewhere. And so, conservancies often were earning in Kenya. I think conservancies were earning about an estimated $12 million a year. So that revenue will be drastically reduced this year and into next year. And figuring out both what are the near and the long-term implications of that, and coming up with solutions to that is something that has been on top of the agenda for conservationists around Africa, and that we'll be hearing from everyone about today. And how's that going, and what's it causing folks to think about in terms of how we can create a more resilient conservation sector for the future. And I think when the pandemic first hit, the concern that everyone's had is we can't lose 10 years or 20 years of progress in places like Kenya, Namibia, Tanzania, Zambia. We can't have the pandemic roll back the progress for communities, for civil society, and for conservation goals. And again, I think that's where a lot of the responding to the challenges has come in. So that's the big picture context. And again, now we're going to go into more detail at the national scale, at the local scale, and hear from this group about what's actually happening in their countries, in their communities, how they're responding and how they're seeing the future of conservation in this context. So our five panelists are Dixon Kalo, who is the CEO of the Kenya Wildlife Conservancies Association. And I'll tell you a little bit more about everyone as we turn to them in our first round of the panel. And then we have Tapiwa Makiwa, who is the CEO of the Community Conservation Fund of Namibia. Bupe Banda, who is the National Administrator for the Zambia National Community Resources Board Association. So Dixon, Tapiwa, and Bupe are all working for national associations and are really key national civil society organizations that are supporting community conservation at a national scale. Working more at the local and the landscape scale are Damien Bell, who is the executive director and founder of Honey Guide, working in northern Tanzania, and Sheila Funnel, who is the program manager of Grevy Zebra Trust, joining us from northern Kenya. So what we're going to do is we're going to have a series of kind of rounds of going through a set of questions around challenges, solutions, opportunities. We're going to hear from everyone in turns, everyone kind of keeping responses to 3 minutes or less. And we'll have a chance to hear from everyone and then kind of have a further discussion around some of the themes that are arising. So the first question that everyone is going to respond to is just describing the key challenges that you've been confronting in your work at the local scale, at the national scale, in your country, in your communities, as a result of the COVID pandemic, and as it relates to the community-based conservation efforts that you're leading. So we'll first turn to Dixon. As I said, Dixon is CEO of the Kenya Wildlife Conservancies Association, which is a really critical national organization in Kenya and really in all of Africa, bringing together this national conservancies movement in Kenya that has become one of the most important community conservation movements anywhere in Africa. And KWCA represents about 120 member conservancies from all around the country, very diverse areas, from the coast, from the north, from the Masai Mara, from Amboseli and the Savo ecosystem. So Dixon has a unique national perspective, and I think has really been in a critical role in working with the conservancies and with government and other stakeholders to find solutions to the challenges that this critical movement has faced this year. Dixon.
Thank you very much, Fred, and thank you all for joining us on this very important, I hope, insightful discussion, and I look forward to continue engaging with you going forward. As Fred has introduced me, I basically lead an association that is based out of Nairobi, looking after the Conservancy movement, which by all means is a very young movement of communities and private landowners that are supporting government efforts to manage wildlife in a country that has only 8% of its land under national parks and reserves. And so these areas are critically important, particularly because we have a lot of wildlife that require to move beyond the boundaries of national parks and reserve to access resources, and also that our tourism industry relies on that and that very basic that resource. When the COVID situation came in, the first impact is the lockdown of the Nairobi as the capital city. Most organizations are based here and could not travel down in the field, and including ourselves. But one of the really important lesson we learned is that the areas out, the community conservation organizations outside of Nairobi, within grassroots, at the grassroots level, are really important. We are also an organization that is based on working on policy to create an enabling policy environment. And so that's our focus. And during the COVID situation, we realized again that government priorities have changed. Government is focusing on the health situation. And so our policy program was out there, and we had to organize ourselves around the government priorities, which was the response towards the COVID situation. We had a collapse in tourism. Our national parks and reserves, and particularly our conservancies, rely on tourism income for their operational cost. and tourism did collapse as a result of travel cancellation. And the money generated by conservancies to pay leases, pay the rangers, became unavailable almost immediately. And that presented a new challenge with conservancies trying to operate without income. Staff were therefore being laid off, either in tourism facilities, in horticultural farms in some of the areas. And for example, in one instance, we had flower farms laying off more than 6,000 workers who then had to rely on other sources of income to survive, or basically they remained jobless. And we saw a growth in bushmeat as people tried to look for other sources of protein. At the conservancy level, the staff generally were either on half pay or working half day. And even more importantly, there was some that were volunteering. And again, that was quite an insight for me, because I went to quite a number of conservancies and I saw community rangers and managers who without salary were still volunteering, and emphasizes the importance of ownership and interest in conservation beyond it being an income generator. The cost of running conservancies introduced a new challenge. Every conservancy now had to become a COVID awareness organization. They had to procure PPEs, the personal protection equipment for the rangers, for the communities, to feed the feeding programs. And these were unanticipated expenses that came into the conservancies. And also the issue of access to health services. Majority of our conservancies do run health and education programs, and they all recorded a decline in the number of visitation from the local communities as a result of fear of contracting the virus. In some places, we saw a drive towards land subdivision. Some of our group ranches started going through the idea of subdividing the land, which then led to land sales and changes in land use, especially in a place like Amboseli, where we saw rain-fed agriculture beginning to show up in some of our critical conservancies, and therefore representing a new challenge to conservation. Lastly, is the working from home. All of us, especially in community areas, work by visiting and working and sitting under the trees with communities. And all of a sudden, we had to operate from working at home, trying to make calls here and there. And that presented a new challenge that most of us were not prepared for. Thank you, Fred.
Thanks so much, Dixon. And as everyone in the audience will have seen, we're just gonna, during this first round, we're just sharing some slides, some images and maps to illustrate the work that each speaker is involved with, and the landscapes and the national conservancies or community conservation areas, just to give everyone a little bit of a feel for that while the speaker is talking during this first round. Thanks, Dixon. I think clearly some of the themes that we'll be discussing throughout, in terms of the collapse of tourism revenue and the longer term implications in terms of bushmeat poaching and also land use change, with even longer term implications, and how those have arisen as threats and challenges. We'll now turn to Tapiwa Makiwa, who, as I said, is the CEO of the Community Conservation Fund of Namibia, which is a relatively new entity. It's a trust fund that's really been set up to help sustain the really outstanding and pioneering community conservation movement that's developed in Namibia over the past 20 years. Again, with really large scale impacts, and known globally as a pioneer in community conservation. So Tapiwa, tell us about some of the challenges that this year has brought for that work and the community conservation movement in Namibia.
Thank you, Fred. Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for joining. I definitely concur. I think our experiences are very similar with the ones that Dixon has just highlighted. As a result of the lack of income from tourism and its related activities, there are quite a lot of financing limitations. But maybe just not to repeat what Dixon has also said, just to add on a couple of issues. As a result of just the situations on the ground, it's not only the rural folk that have lost their jobs. The urban folk have lost their jobs, and they have tended, as we do in Africa, to go back home into the rural areas. That is then bring about, the age-old phenomenon now back. It used to be rural to urban migration. Now it's urban to rural, and that is putting increased pressure on the natural resources in these areas. The lack of income thereof results, and we saw that in the very first months of the lockdown, in a slight increase in the poaching incidences we were having, as people try to look for alternative ways to put food on the table. In some cases that are very, very specific, some of the tourism activities that occur in these areas actually aids to the monitoring. So, for example, when people come in and do things like rhino trekking activities with the game guards, that is actually one of the measures in which we are tracking these resources and ensuring that there's no poaching activities going on. In the absence of tourism, it becomes an additional cost to do this without, ad hoc, without any supplementary income coming in. But just to bring the biggest challenge Namibia has faced into the limelight, as you alluded to, Fred, Namibia has 20% of its country under communal conservation. That's about 225,000 residents affected. That's slightly over 10% of the Namibian population. There's currently about 177 enterprises that are based around sustainable use of natural resources in these communal areas, 61 of which are accommodation facilities, either lodges or campsites, etc., bringing in funds from tourism that is then put back into conservation. This alone has facilitated roughly 4,000 to 5,000 jobs. As of 2018, it was 4,926 jobs within these communal conservancies. Again, taking a figure from 2018, the communal conservancy drive in Namibia generated close to $9 million as returns to local communities. Over the years, over the 20 to 30 years, this program has been running. We have seen a lot of gains in terms of the environment. It's the lowest 7,500, for example, in elephant numbers, which have risen to roughly a population of over 22,000. There is a healthy rhino population in Namibia's community conservancies. Unlike certain other, in the rest of the world where rhinos can only now be found in protected areas, we've got rhinos in these communal areas that are guarded by these communities in Namibia. We have an increased number of lions, and the lion range has expanded. But that's just among others, in terms of just picking probably the iconic animals. So truly speaking, that the scale in Namibia, conservation has become a way of life and a very competitive, land use option. So the biggest issue that we have faced during this period really is, that potential breakdown or reversal of these hard-earned environmental and social gains that have been accumulated over quite a long time. It's a legacy issue. There's a fear, looking at what has gone on over the last couple of months, that when we do get out of this without certain relevant interventions, the attitudes and the actual physical losses towards, the current model of community-based natural resource management may have changed, and we might not have as much vested stakeholders as we have for such a successful model over the last 20, 30 years.
Thanks to Piwa. Yeah, I think that really, those figures really illustrate one of the key themes in community-based conservation everywhere, which is that coupling between generating revenue and business opportunities and income opportunities for communities. You said 177 enterprises across more than 80 conservancies in Namibia, which has really made wildlife and conservation an economic asset. Now, how do we sustain that so the value of wildlife and wild spaces is retained? That's core to the challenges that everyone's facing this year and in the near future. We'll turn now to Zambia, another incredibly resource-rich, beautiful country. And Bupe Banda is with the National Community Resources Board Association, which represents, I think, 76 community resource boards. These boards are basically community associations that represent communities in rural areas, primarily the game management areas, which make up about 20% of Zambia's land area, and are areas where people live alongside wildlife, often around protected areas, and are involved in a range of activities and initiatives, again, to help put in place community conservation that delivers benefits for both people and wildlife. So the CRB Association is like Dixon's organization in Kenya, is a national representative body for communities all throughout Zambia. Bupe, tell us about the situation in Zambia.
Thanks, Fred. Good morning and good afternoon, everybody who has joined us. I'm happy that you had some time to join us and listen into this webinar. So to begin with, I think it would be very interesting to note that the Zambian setup of community conservation is over 70% dependent on tourism and hunting. But with the coming in of COVID, we've had restrictions around travel. So we've had some countries that have been locked down, which has made international tourism and safari hunting almost impossible in Zambia this year. But then when you look at our community resources boards, that's where they depend much for their revenues, for them to run those community institutions. Like Fred has said, these community resources boards are about 76 countrywide, and they are managing communal lands which are stretched in an area that is about 167,000 square kilometers. So these community resources boards rely on these revenues from hunting and tourism for them to do their game management area operations. They rely on those funds for them to do a lot of community development within their areas and within their chiefdoms. And this is also a major source of income for them to employ people from the community as community scouts, as game guards, and even in the tourism sector. But then with the coming in of COVID, we are already anticipating a loss of over $5 million US. And this is really a huge impact on our community resources funds. I think it will also be interesting for us to note that the 76 community resources boards actually have a huge workforce when it comes to law enforcement. Our government has employed wildlife officers, but you find that in most cases, the ratio of wildlife police officers to the ratio of the scouts that are employed by the community resources board is usually 1 to 6. So this already shows us that our communities are doing much of the law enforcement. And if nothing is done to bail out the community resources board in terms of their wage bill for their community scouts, then we are already anticipating an increase in poaching in these communities. So the key challenge that we face as Zambia in terms of community-based conservation is really the loss in revenue. As an association, or rather an umbrella organization for these community resources boards, we also do a lot of coordination for our membership. But then this year we have seen that it's almost impossible for us to meet them physically. So even our operations as an office has been affected. We do a lot of policy engagement with government. So all this has been put on a slow motion because we can't meet all the offices that we have to meet in a physical meeting. So basically, that's how much we are affected in Zambia.
Thanks so much, Bupe. Good. Well, now we'll zoom in a little bit more at the landscape scale and with our next two speakers, and look at what's happening more at the community and landscape level in Tanzania and Kenya. So we'll turn to Damien Bell from Honey Guide, which is really the organization that's at the forefront of trying to make community-based conservation work from an economic and business standpoint for local communities, how to make wildlife and conservation a winning business proposition And in particular, they're focused on what are called wildlife management areas, or WMAs, which are kind of like conservancies in Kenya or Namibia, where communities have the right to manage wildlife, and have set up their own conservation areas, and often business partnerships with tourism or hunting or other investors to try to generate benefits from their conservation efforts. Damien, tell us about the challenges that this year has brought at the local and the landscape scale.
Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Great to be here and be a part of this conversation. It's already been really insightful listening to some of our colleagues in Namibia and Zambia. And I think, generally, I could say the challenge is that we are, and especially our partners, the communities are having it very similar to everywhere else. It's all around the funding. A couple of weeks ago, I bumped into some of our community members, a board meeting that was going on, and one of the board members came out, and his discussion, it was all about, well, when COVID came, at first there was this panic about the health reasons, but then we realized that there are no more tourists, and we felt there was a panic coming up because we suddenly realized that all the work we've done all these years, everything that we had worked on and believed in, suddenly was in a very fragile state. And he was saying, and we were really surprised to suddenly find, you guys keep on moving on, and able to suddenly support very last minute these funds that we were expecting from tourism. And the reason why I'm saying this is that, yes, I think funding has been a problem, but it's more of a problem. We're the NGOs, we're the problem solvers out there for these communities, and I think that's there's an opportunity here which we'll talk about later. But that's also something that's also critically important, is that we are the organizations that come in with solutions for communities. We're the kind of the organizations that trust us. Community conservation is a really good thing. Your livelihoods will get better. Listen to how we can show you the ABC of getting there. People like Sam, who you're seeing right now, they listen to him, they trust him. And so when suddenly this comes up, what's really at stake here is trust in conservation. And when you go deeper into what is conservation, it is something that has come from the outside world, the Western world, in a sense. It's the Western world and us from conservation is saying to these communities, hey, there is a future in this. There is a way you can live with wildlife and you can actually benefit. And so when that big crack opened up, I think the ability of all these organizations to be able to respond was critical. And I think that's something that was a huge challenge to us, is to ensure that they could trust us. It was very difficult because as you're moving forward saying trust, and we're putting that face on, at the very same time, Honey Guide and all these organizations you'll be hearing from were very worried that where's the funding going to come from now? How are we going to continue to be able to support these communities through this really challenging time in all sorts of aspects? And so I think how I see it, and one of the
Looks like Damien is frozen, as does happen from time to time. So let's move from Tanzania. We'll come back to Damien shortly on our next round. But let's just move on to Sheila Funnel, who is program manager for Grevy Zebra Trust, which again is a pioneering organization working. It's the only organization dedicated as its mission to the conservation of the Grevy zebra, which is a unique endemic species found only in 90% of the population is in northern Kenya, mostly on community lands, and some of the conservancies that Dixon talked about. But really, most of Grevy Zebra Trust's work is around rangeland management and landscape management, and they've been a leader in working with communities and linking species-focused conservation to community welfare and empowerment for many years. So Sheila, tell us about the challenges of this year in relation to your mission in Northern Kenya.
Thank you so much, Fred, and thank you all of you who are able to join us. I'm really excited to be here today because I think this conversation that we're having is so important for the future of conservation, not just of Grevy zebra or sort of key species, but ecosystem level conservation. And I'll just start with sort of setting the scene. So for Grevy Zebra Trust, or for Grevy Zebra, its ability to survive entirely depends on its ability to coexist with people. About 2% or just under 2% of Grevy zebra are found within protected areas. So you can imagine the scale of this endangered species. About 3,000 individuals remain in the wild. The majority of that is found within community-owned land. So working with communities has been absolutely critical to the conservation of this species. And communities have always been at the center of the conservation initiatives that we design. So they support us in designing and implementing those conservation initiatives. So working with communities has sort of been critical. COVID-19, however, has presented challenges, and some of those are similar to what's already been highlighted in terms of, I think Dixon mentioned sort of the relationship with the community. For us, that's critical, that's vital. On a day-to-day basis before COVID-19 hit, we were supporting the community outside of even our primary goals that achieve our strategies, little things like providing transport, supporting communities to get from A to B, to attend meetings. That was critical. That built our relationship with the community, and now we can't do that. So that is so COVID-19 has impacted our relationship with the community in terms of our ability to support the community in that way. However, I think one of the key ways in which COVID-19 has impacted us as well is through our ability to engage with communities. So Fred, you highlighted that a lot of our work stems from supporting rangelands. So one of our primary goals within the organization is healthy rangelands. And for us to achieve that, communities are at the center of that. So GZT sort of promotes a benefit system that is livelihood based. And so our ability to engage with communities has been challenged because we're not able to meet with them. We can't sit down with communities and chat with them and talk to them, develop solutions, develop ideas to sort of enhance rangeland health. So that has been a challenge that we've been trying to address. We have adapted to some extent, but certainly that has been one of the critical challenges that we have been facing. Another challenge that we faced is, our team. The majority of our team, over 90% of our team, lives within the Grevy zebra range. However, for a lot of us, or for some of us, around 10% of us, who also work on critical decisions surrounding Grevy zebra, we're not able to travel to the field. We're not able to see Grevy zebra. We're not able to interact with the people that are living with Grevy zebra and driving their conservation. So for us, finding a sort of a replica to mimic the energy, the motivation, the enthusiasm that we would normally get from sort of being in the field, being on site, being with Grevy zebra, that's been hard to replicate, but we have been trying to find solutions. We've adapted to the situation, which I'll highlight a bit later. I wanted to touch on funding as well, because for GZT and for the communities that we work with, or for majority of them, it's not really tourism that sort of monetary system that benefits the community. For us, as I highlighted, the benefit system we focus on is livelihood-based. It's rangelands, healthy rangelands to support livelihoods through livestock and wildlife. So in that respect, it differs because our funding comes from international organizations. So on a global scale, zoos, philanthropists, sort of these organizations have been hit by COVID-19, and that has limited the funding that has been available to GZT. So I think in that respect, it's sort of different in terms of relying on tourism to support conservation. For us, it's been funding from organizations at the global level for us to carry out our activities. Yes, I think those are the main things I wanted to highlight.
Thank you so much, Sheila. Yeah, so just to distill things a little bit, I think some of the key categories that we've heard from in terms of the challenges across the 4 countries and from the local to the national scale. Well, one is definitely around revenue and business, right? You know, conservation, conservation needs funding to keep scouts in the field, to keep management going, to keep incentives flowing to communities. So there's a revenue, there's a business challenge. A lot of that revolves, you know, really around the tourism, travel, you know, and hunting sector. And then there are capacity challenges, right? In terms of having, again, the resources and just the logistical ability to keep community operations going, keep game scouts providing the support, keep conservancies functioning. Then there's a bigger, longer term challenge, which Tapiwa and Dixon and Bupe all highlighted in terms of kind of keeping communities bought into conservation, invested in conservation, the threat of land use change. And I think that's really the biggest long-term concern, is that can you lose the momentum that conservancies and other community conservation initiatives and programs like Grevy Zebra Trusts have developed. And so we're thinking about both kind of long-term and short-term challenges. You know, and a lot of the challenges around losing that local buy-in, losing momentum with community initiatives, challenges from surge of illegal use, as Dixon described, with 6,000 flower farm workers being out of work, maybe, and living very close to conservancies and other protected areas. They've actually gotten a lot of media attention. There have been articles in the Washington Post and the Guardian. Some of Dixon colleagues have been on international TV programs talking about these challenges. But I think what hasn't gotten as much attention, and what we're going to turn to now and spend the rest of our time, or most of the rest of our time talking about, are the solutions, right? And how all of you are responding. Because we've got to use this opportunity to be forward-thinking. And you all have, in your work, done amazing work to respond to these challenges. And so that's what we want to hear from now, and learn from each other about how do we solve the near-term challenges, and how do we think better about the long-term challenges facing conservation. So we want to hear from everyone on the strategies and solutions that you've been using to respond to the challenges described. And what's proving most effective and important in this rapidly moving 6 months that we've experienced. And so we'll start more at the local community scale and go right back to Sheila, and then Damien, and then work our way back. So Sheila, back to you.
Thanks so much, Fred. I think that's a really good question, because I think sort of focusing on the solutions that we're using to address these challenges really highlights the sustainability of conservation in each of the areas that we are working in. I think for Grevy Zebra Trust, one of the key things that we did is focused on our strengths as an organization. So within our strategic plan, we've really gotten to the depths of what makes our organization work. So we really looked at focusing on our strengths. And I think we realized that our conservation approach that utilizes that benefit system that I was talking about, that livelihood-based benefit system, has made us and the communities resilient to a lot of the shocks or tremors that we're sort of seeing, one of which is COVID-19. So we realized that was our biggest strength. So one of the first things that we started doing when COVID-19 sort of presented itself was sort of educate people. Look, this is a disease that's out there. You know, for a lot of people in northern Kenya, some of these communities are so isolated that that sort of education or awareness, you have no idea, you know, you don't know where it's coming from. So we really focused on getting the message out there. And I think just from that one thing, people could see that GZT isn't just an organization that is about Grevy zebra. You know, we sort of highlighted our support or relationships with the community. And I think that's so important for all organizations that are working with communities, is for communities to see that they are valued. And I think that would translate back to those communities valuing wildlife in itself. So we raised awareness about COVID-19, and I remember one of our team members. He's a Rendile warrior based in Lysamis in Marsabit County, and he, you know, their traditional sort of cultural systems doesn't really allow for men and women to come together, congregate in one room during community meetings. And during these COVID awareness meetings, this warrior sort of realized how integral it was for the whole community to hear this message. And he brought his family along, his wife, her friends, and they sort of all sat around, you know, listening to this meeting. So I think that just showed how when these challenges do face us, it can sort of bring, it can transcend traditions and cultures, and we need to see that as an opportunity. For us as well, we've also adapted our activities. We've created protocols, very strict protocols around COVID-19, because I think we need to highlight why we are doing things in a certain way. So if we say to community members, we can't take you from A to B, we have something to show that this is why we can't do it. We're following that protocol. You need to follow that protocol. And it sort of gives us a reliable basis where people see, okay, these guys are really doing trying to protect us from something. So again, having protocols in place that are strictly followed has been very critical for us. We've also adapted our activities where our data collection systems are now remote. So that's been really critical. Our community meetings, we're still having community meetings, but very strictly observing COVID-19 protocols. And one of the key things that we've done is transitioned one of our projects, which was reusable sanitary pads. And we have been focusing on making masks for the community. So we've made about 6,000 masks so far. And those masks that we're making, 3-ply masks, are very effective, are a zebra pattern. So again, we're trying to relate the support we're giving to communities to conservation of the species. So I think for us, the solutions and strategies has been focusing on our strengths and really trying to show the communities that we're working with that we are there in the long term. We're there to support them. And really do care about their livelihoods and their health. Thank you.
Thanks, Sheila. Yeah, that's a really critical point in terms of how those strong grassroots relationships can be reinforced during a time of crisis. And for the long term, communities, of course, are going to, you know, when you're going through a crisis, everyone remembers who was by your side and who provided the support and who helped you go through it. And maybe zebra pattern masks are one creative way of doing that. Damien, let's turn back to you, assuming we got you unfrozen, and hear about how you're responding and the solutions that Honey Guy's working on in northern Tanzania.
Right, hopefully it won't cut me off so early. Yeah, I think one of the things that we do, and I didn't manage to put that in before I got cut out last time, is that we work with wildlife management areas, as Fred mentioned earlier on, but we really look at them as businesses and how to make the WMA, the wildlife management area, work for the people. And that's their business. They've invested land in this and they want to see some kind of benefit. And albeit that this time, everyone knows is a difficult time during a business in tourism and every other business, but they also would realize it's a difficult time in their business. So they're very aware that the benefits during this period are going to be difficult to come by. But when, I'll just give you an example of handling the community see in having the wildlife management area.
Hey, All right. Well, Damien froze again. We'll see if turning Damien's video off helps. Let's jump over to Bupe and talk about the national scale in Zambia. In terms of kind of the challenges you described, Bupe, around revenue and community scouts, and the challenges facing the communities that you represent. How have you guys responded? What kind of solutions are you working on in Zambia?
Truly speaking, I think COVID has been a wake-up call for us as Zambians, for us to tap into the existing opportunities. Because one of the greatest opportunities that we have experienced with the coming in of COVID has been massive collaborations between the government, the conservation NGOs, and the community. We have seen a situation where the Department of National Parks and Wildlife has put up a task force which has got representation from the communities, representation from the government, and representation from the conservation NGOs. The job of this task force is to develop a contingency plan that will help bail out the CRBs, especially when it comes to their wage bill for community scouts' salaries. So priority has been given to law enforcement. At the same time, this strategic plan is supposed to also help out the community resources boards with some livelihoods that are not dependent on tourism or hunting. Apart from that, we have also seen robust encouragement for us to engage in domestic trade. Just during the recent World Tourism Day, our Minister of Tourism officially launched the campaign to promote domestic tourism. And with that, we have seen a number of tour operators that have got lodges within the game management areas, reducing their prices for accommodation and designing, or rather offering packages that are affordable to the locals, just for them to increase sources of revenues. We've also seen our office, which is the National CRB Association, collaborate with other partners to increase community-based tourism. Here, we are focusing on the tourism facilities and tourism products that are being offered by our Community Resources Board. So the plan is to develop a digital platform where we can help advertise what products are being offered by our Community Resources Board. Then we've also seen the Ministry of Tourism and Arts work closely with the CAZA, which is the Kavango Zambezi Transfrontier Conservation Area, and even influencing them to contribute over $30 million towards the Kafue ecosystem. So this contribution is not only meant for law enforcement, but it's also meant for other livelihood projects that are being carried out in the community resources boards that are around the Kafue ecosystem. We've got about 9 community resources boards that are around the Kafue National Park. So these are the beneficiaries of this funding from Kavango Zambezi Transfrontier Conservation Area. So all in all, we have learned that during such a crisis, what has really been helpful is collaborating, working with each other as partners, coming up with strategies and trying to implement them. On the local level, our CRBs have also helped in distributing face masks. They've also helped in distributing sanitizers and the like. Thank you.
Thanks, Bupe. Government collaboration, looking for alternative revenue sources, domestic tourism, important themes. We're going to try Damien again with Damien's video switched off, just so we can hear what he was saying about Tanzania. Damien, let's try you again for a couple minutes.
Okay, yeah. So what I was saying is, because this is a business, and when COVID started to approach, at one stage there was this panic going on as to what is this kind of disease coming up, And that was critical, the information that was coming out of Honey Guide and being able to speak to communities and talk about them about how to stay safe. Fortunately, in Tanzania, we had a president that said, listen, don't worry about this. Let's get on with business. And that has actually played out okay. We are back to business in Tanzania. However, during that time, one of the things we really decided to step up on was help these guys protect their crops. There's enough challenges out there. There's stress about this this international pandemic. So let's focus on trying to get some kind of good stories going with them and something going. So we focused a lot on crop protection and doubled up our efforts. And I think that kind of was critical at that stage, because when the communities are depending on crop protection and a few other things, enabling that to carry on has been really useful as far as getting them to realize that whatever happens, this conservation game, this business they're in, is worthwhile. And that's something that, rather than we tried to look at how we could make the best of this moment and how we could secure the community's attitudes towards conservation. The other thing in Randolin that they really value is they value the rangelands and the rangelands and how the community are able at a larger scale to secure that as a grazing bank. And this requires a management scale. It requires managers, vehicles out there to protect their rangelands from illegal use. And this was able to continue. So I think with those two strategies, in a sense, we've enabled the communities to feel that things are normal and that their business is still working for them. I did see a comment actually in the box there, and I'd just like to refer to that is, are there other income generating activities apart from tourism? And I'd like to just say something. The world of conservation is really expensive. Okay, and for Randolin, WMA, and I was looking at a couple of others, you're talking about $190,000 a year they have to operate on, and for the large part, $100,000 can be swallowed up by protection. So, what other business model can pay for an annual $100,000 business in protection alone, not management or governance? And so when you look at that, beekeeping and all these, they're smaller, they're also trying to attitude changing. They're not your boots on the ground. So what we're constantly looking at, and COVID hasn't triggered this at all, is how can you continue to reduce that protection costs? How can you continue to drive down the cost of protection, drive down the need for patrols and expensive ways of protecting, and move it towards where the community at large are protecting, and you don't have to spend so much money. And I think, coming back to it, these areas, tourism is always going to be critical. And if you've got big game, lions and elephants, things like that, it's always going to be an expensive game. And what we're looking at here is, like any business, how do the community at this end take their business on, like any other business, say, this is just a hard time, and we're not investing this in the short term. They've got their vision for the long term, and they're not going to suddenly jump out and drop this thing they've worked on for all these years just because there's a hiccup in the business. It's really saying, how can we buckle down on our costs? How can we reduce our costs, secure our business in Randolin, its crop protection and rangeland management, and come out of this as a business? So I think that's kind of, rather than saying other income generating activities, I found very few, except for carbon, which we're working on in Makame, which is actually going the opposite. There's more carbon being sold as everyone's realizing what's going on and seeing how it can work. But I just think they aren't in for it for the short term. These communities are invested in the long term. We are here, you are here out there for all of us to understand this. And this is just a hiccup on the road. Thanks.
Thanks, Damien. Yeah, we've gotten quite a few questions in the chat that I just want to refer to a little bit around, like food security. And I think one of the themes that's coming up, Damien, and as you referred to it in terms of the value of these community conservation areas as a grazing bank for livestock grazing, Sheila referred to that in terms of, the benefit not really being more around livelihoods and rangelands and not necessarily tourism up in northern Kenya, of that link between how community conservation delivers value for food and for livelihoods and for livestock, and maybe creating a bit more of an emphasis on that during the pandemic as well. But
yeah,
let's see if
we have to make it much deeper, Fred. Yeah, we have to make conservation much deeper.
Let's come back to that theme as we talk about opportunities. But we want to hear now from Tapiwa and then Dixon, because really Namibia and Kenya, for all the reasons that were discussed around the scale of community conservation, I think their organizations have both been at the center of working with government and private sector and others to figure out solutions that involve financing and that involve supporting management costs. And so Tapiwa and Dixon, we'd love to hear about how that's played out in Namibia and Kenya over the last 6 months. Tapiwa?
Thanks, Fred. I think some of the concepts are really much the same. In terms of strategies and solutions, we have used this side. Very key to that has been coordination at a national level. We have joined hands with all the stakeholders in the industry, in the community-based natural resource management industry. So that is from the Ministry of Environment and Tourism, the NGOs on the ground, us as a funding mechanism. We are essentially a funding mechanism, a CTF, Conservation Trust Fund, but together with critical donors. Now, what has been interesting is that some non-traditional donors, people who have not donated necessarily to conservation, have pitched in these current circumstances to assist. So apart from just coordination, there's been an integrated approach to what we are doing. There's also been a little bit of more flexibility with the funds that have come in for this, because look, it's an emergency, and therefore the need and the critical issues needs to be dealt with as they come. You can't plan 3, 4, 5 years in advance. So, for example, we have managed to get about 8 funding sources that we are currently using, set up a national task force with all these people involved. And I'm pleased to say at the moment, all 86 of our conservancies have managed to get some grants to keep operating. So based on the data we have that we've accumulated over years, we've been able to identify what are the costs of conservation in these conservancies. What does it take? How much has it taken over the last 2 years to ensure that there's continued patrols, there's continued anti-poaching patrols, there's continued governance, because governance is also an issue in these times where there is not much interaction, and therefore, meetings have to go on, albeit within the restrictions and within the guidelines, the COVID-friendly guidelines. So we have managed to ensure all 86 currently conservancies are being supported to ensure their activities continue to go. We have identified all the game guards in these conservancies, and we have managed to raise some funding to ensure they continue to get paid some form of salary so that they are compensated for their continued efforts. As I said, we have currently got about 8 funding sources. The level of coordination has been pretty positive, and it has presented a very good opportunity for further coordination with, say, for example, the health industry. These conservancies and their structures of governance are now being used to ensure that we have also distributed, just like I think it was Bupe who referred to that, we have assisted to distribute some sanitizers, we've assisted to distribute some masks, so that whatever activities continue to happen in these conservancies happen within a COVID-safe environment.
Thanks, Tapiwa.
So in a nutshell, Fred, certainly the flexibility, integrated response, and coordination at national level have been the strategies that have worked for us so far.
Yeah, and I'll just say it's from the outside, it's amazing to see how fast government and civil society and the private sector in Namibia have come together, as you described, and collaborated on the near-term response. And I think that's a reflection of 20, 30 years of strong collaboration through groups like NACSO, the Namibian Association of CBNRM support organizations that brings together different NGOs, the NGOs in the field, the leadership within government. that long-term collaboration really provides the capacity to respond in the near term so effectively. Dixon, tell us about the response and some of the solutions being pursued in Kenya.
Yeah, thank you, Fred. And I think quite a number of the points that have been raised by my colleagues are pretty much relevant to our situation. And so I may not want to repeat them. However, I think the two major concerns that we had at the onset of the COVID situation was number one, the potential likely collapse of decades of conservation effort, of which I have spent 22 years of my life struggling with these communities and working in these very rural areas to reconcile the need for communities and that of conservation. And that was quite a distressing moment for a lot of conservation actors, particularly in the community areas that have invested all this time and energy and resources to keep this conservation movement and other similar approaches going. The second concern was really the possibility of the spread of the coronavirus in some of these community areas, because some of them tend also to be our destination where tourists do visit. We have tourism facilities, 140 of them in conservancies, in areas that are very much underserved by health services. And so there was a general concern that should coronavirus spread within these communities, it's going to be a major challenge because of the access to health facilities. And so one of our first immediate effort was to join up forces with government, and thanks to several years of working together with government, to join a task force organized by the Ministry of Health to develop protocols. And a particular chapter was dedicated to protocols for COVID response and behavior in community conservancies. And that was being observed then by the conservancies themselves, but also anybody visiting a conservancy. And again, I think that was really a big change, because we managed to introduce within government circle, within government protocols, the idea that community conservation areas are really important. They are destinations and they need to be protected against the virus. And therefore, the conservancies themselves had a major shift in terms of their operations to also include COVID awareness in their campaigns. We did share these protocols across the country, and some of our landscape associations and also the conservancies themselves domesticated them and began processes and investing in campaigns to educate the communities around how to keep safe and how to maintain social distancing and other recommendations from the Ministry of Health. Now, the second initiative that we got into is to begin working with the government to support the conservancies themselves. And traditionally, and over the last 3 decades, conservancies have relied on their own generated income through tourism, through livestock, through carbon and other sources to maintain their operations. And we saw that this is a difficult moment, and we went to the government and had discussions with government, and government positively responded with a direct injection of a 1 year worth of salary for 3,500 rangers through our organization, and also another 5,500 rangers through the Kenya Wildlife Service. So this really more than doubled the number of community youth that are involved in conservation, and that exercise is still continuing, with the funding likely to be beginning to flow. And also within that, a contribution by government of nearly $2 million to set up a national trust fund, which we'll be talking to Tapiwa soon about, so that they can share some of the lessons, as Kenya is also going to create a support fund for conservancies in the long term. Now, the $8 million that government injected into the conservancies is going to keep nearly all our rangers. We have 4,000 rangers working in conservancies, and 3,500 of them are now covered with a monthly income that is going directly from government to the rangers to keep them as part salary, to keep them going within the next year, with hopefully discussion going forward on how that can be maintained. And this is actually very useful because a lot of the rangers were already on half pay or on quarter pay. And so this contribution from government is going to see the Conservancy rangers who play a critical role, not just as eyes on the ground for wildlife, but also as community members working in the interface between wildlife and the communities and addressing issues of human-wildlife conflict. In addition to that, also as an organization, we had to change that and now began taking on roles that traditionally were not designed or we are not working on, particularly through supporting our regional associations. We have 12 of them across our key landscapes, and each of them established a crisis committee and a crisis fund. And 3 of them actually were relatively successful in supporting the conservancies within their landscapes. Even through KWC, we were able to support directly 4 conservancies to keep them going, to keep the supply of water to the ranger bases, the food to the ranger, and the other essential services going within the conservancies, and also alerted quite a lot of our partners on the need to support these conservancies during this time. And I can confidently say that what we expected to happen, which was really a collapse, did not actually happen. And although we know we are not yet out of the woods, I think so far we've been able to maintain. Now, the other important innovation that came out of the COVID situation was the innovation by the conservancies themselves. Very interesting crowdfunding opportunities that they began developing, virtual tours. I think some of you may have seen conservancies doing virtual tours, adopt a NECA campaigns. Quite a number of innovative fundraising opportunities were utilized by a number of conservancies, and there are lessons learned there and how that can be upscaled going forward, and especially as we recover through the COVID situation. The need for livelihood diversification, as some of my colleagues have already mentioned. We have a few conservancies in one of our landscape that already were on a carbon program in the Savo region. And then those conservancies were faring much better. They were still having their own income from carbon credit, and they were able to run their operations. And that has caused the importance of diversifying income sources from the conservancies so that they can continue operating in this difficult situation. But also a lot of discussion ongoing on how best can community-based conservation be funded in the long term, and how can there be options of creating reserve mechanisms to keep the conservancies going. And that discussion is still live, and we'll still be pursuing that debate to see how these conservancies can survive the next shock. Thank you.
Thanks, Dixon. So as we've only got about 15 minutes left of the session, a lot of really great insights came up. And as Dixon said, I think, one of the speed of the response in some places, the way that has helped address really in a short period of time the concerns around collapse, which of course are not over by a long shot, but really impressive progress. And I just want to sum up a few of the themes which relate also to a lot of the questions that have been coming in, a lot of which have been around kind of the alternative income and the financing model. And really, I think the discussion we're having and that we need to continue having in African conservation, community conservation, perhaps globally, is around the economic and the financing model, right? How conservation is paid for. And as everyone's described, the big challenge is around the dependence that's been there on tourism, on kind of a single golden egg, as it were. And now what we're seeing and what we're hearing and what we're feeling pressure around is looking beyond that, right? And thinking about conservation and food security and the value of conservancies, not only for tourism, but for livestock grazing or regenerative rangeland management. And how that can create or for alternative products like carbon credits, which is happening in Kenya and Tanzania and Zambia and growing, or forestry, alternative products to create a kind of a wider economic suite of opportunities. But also public financing. And really interesting, as Dixon described, how the Kenyan government has stepped up, how the government in Namibia has stepped up, recognizing the importance of these assets and the importance of employment in community conservation areas, and the strategic importance to the tourism sector and to the economy more widely, and made new investments. And as you said, Dixon, maybe creating new opportunities for long-term financing mechanisms. So just thinking about some of those themes that have come up, and other points across all the different experiences. We want to do one final round, and let's keep responses to just kind of 1 minute and one key opportunity that you guys have seen from your own experience or from what you're hearing from others. What's one key opportunity that we need to really focus on and take forward in African community conservation, as we think about the future and as we continue to deal with the pandemic? So take a few minutes, a few seconds just to think about that. And then I am going to come to Damien first, since I know you've already got a lot of ideas on opportunities. Just one minute, we'll do a quick round. Let's go Damien, Sheila, Bupe, Dixon, and Tapiwa.
I might as well start off by 1 minute.
Yeah.
I think what we're doing is basically, we're an organization that's building capacity, communities to manage these wildlife management areas. In this stage here, it's a business. While one is dropping off the financial side of it, tourism are out, we're looking at, let's strengthen management. Let's continue to find the time, as management's time is not being diverted into crisis management with tourism. Let's get them to use this opportunity to build up their management skills. And that's what we're doing. We're doing a lot of coaching and work through learning how to deal with a crisis. And this is what we're looking at, how to manage budgets, how to have very dynamic budgets, very dynamic work plans, and be able to respond, because we're in the business of community-based conservation. It's their business, and they're going to have to understand it's like any other business in the world. It's going to have really lows and it's going to have highs. And when you're on a high, manage it well. When you're on a low, equally. Thanks. I hope that was 1 minute.
That was good. So an opportunity really to foster resilience in management at the local level. Sheila, one big opportunity you see.
Sorry, muted. You asked a question as you were sort of summarizing the points earlier. How is conservation paid for? And I think we've heard that some of the main or primary ways that happens now is through tourism. And for small NGOs that are on the ground, that's from funding from outside sources. But we've seen, COVID-19 has shown us that this payment system isn't sustainable. It's not adaptable, So I think we need to start looking at a more authentic way to view wildlife. And this comes from the people that have been living with wildlife for hundreds of years. There's an intrinsic value to wildlife. And I think that's really what we have to focus on, that intrinsic value to wildlife. And I think, there are systems that have been in place for hundreds of years and I'm talking about systems, for example, in northern Kenya, if I'm talking about the Samburu and Dile cultures, that have protected wildlife for hundreds of years. These systems, these traditions, these cultures have protected wildlife. There's been a value, that intrinsic value for wildlife. And I think as practitioners of conservation, we really need to start focusing on that, sort of move away from these systems that aren't so adaptable, or sort of have it in addition to, these tourism and sort of funding system. So I guess that's my takeaway, sort of focus on that intrinsic value to wildlife for communities that live with wildlife.
Yeah, great point, Sheila. Reconnecting with the cultural values in conservation and natural resources. Bupe, one big opportunity that you see.
We have learned this the hard way. I think our community-based conservation model has been over-dependent on tourism and hunting. So the big lesson is that we should start looking at ways of diversifying the sources of revenue, especially at community level. The CRB Association is looking at building our community resources board into strong community institutions that are sustainable and they are also resilient to such shocks. So I think at a national level, this is the thing that we should be looking at. We are very happy that some of our community resources are already engaged in a RED Plus project. We have about 12 communities that actually benefited from a direct payment from biocarbon partners. The payment was about $2.8 million just last month. So if we can have more of such initiatives where our community resources are not only waiting for safari hunting, then we'll be able to see them grow into strong and sustainable institutions. We also want to see that our community resources board standing on their own to look for such sources of revenues. Thank you. I hope I was under 1 minute.
Great, thanks so much, Bupe. Really important points and great example from RED Plus and the Biocarbon Partners Luangwa initiative. And as you said, significant revenue, which just happened a few months ago. Dixon, from your vantage point in Kenya and at a regional scale, one key opportunity.
I think I'll take to one of the first one is a sense of ownership. Where communities have a strong sense of ownership, you are better off surviving situations like this. And secondly, a strong partnership, both at the community level, at the national level, at the regional level, and globally. I think opportunities like this would require us to work together and to come together to provide solutions to big challenges that we may likely face, like the COVID situation.
Great. Absolutely, Dixon. Yeah. And again, the partnerships, the collaboration, so important in Kenya and Namibia and elsewhere. Tapiwa, over to you. One key opportunity.
Thanks, Fred. I'll try to be very quick. The need to diversify has already been noted too. We are glad to say, look, I think we have noted now that if there was ever any doubt, then the importance of community involvement in conservation is more pronounced now. In the absence of income from tourism, there's a little bit of quiet from the business sector, but the community members continue to do their work. So honestly speaking, this community model works. I think from a Namibian perspective, we were pursuing payments for environmental services called wildlife credits, and we feel that is an alternative income source. We are looking to raise funding to pay these communities for results-oriented conservation, and not necessarily, setting up a target and saying we are paying them for what they have achieved. And there is a pot of funding we have set aside, and we want to build on that. But I think more importantly, the CCFN itself, the organization that I serve, was created with the sole purpose of actually raising some funds and putting them in an endowment fund to ensure sustainable long-term sustainability. So if anything, I think we've also been taught from a Namibian perspective that we are lucky to have 20, 30 years of experience, and we foresaw this, and we have looked at models around the world and said, setting up an endowment fund, not necessarily a sinking day-to-day project fund, amount of funds that says these are dedicated for the long-term sustainability, and this will actually enable us in the future to deal with these kinds of shocks. So this facility is available. We have an endowment fund. We have started about a year or two back. We are targeting roughly $50 million in its various forms. Some of it is impact investment opportunities, but some of it is also typical grants in nature. And we are, of the 50 million, we've raised about 1.2 million, whilst we are utilizing the sinking funds we have. But I think the importance of a long-term sustainable mechanism, in this case, an endowment fund like this, is not to be understated, because it makes sure that in the future, if some of these things befall us again, we're a little bit better prepared, I should say.
Great points, Tiwa. Absolutely. The building on the foresight and the continued strategic creativity in Namibia to be better prepared for this crisis and to provide resilience is a really important point. Well, we're just about out of time. I think, we really believe, and I think all the organizations really embody that the adage, as referred to before, that a crisis is a terrible thing to waste. A crisis creates pressure, it creates opportunities, it creates a real demand and drive to be innovative. And I think we've heard that in terms of rethinking the economic models, the financing models, the collaborations, the partnerships, and we've had a bit of an exchange within the region within Eastern and Southern Africa. But I think it's also clear that the world, conservationists everywhere, have a lot to learn from the kinds of organizations and partnerships that you all are leading in terms of working at the community scale and also at the national level. And again, with the kinds of partnerships, collaborations, and so it's exciting. Despite the challenges, to think about how we can build a stronger set of approaches to conservation at a really important time when we're thinking about future global conservation targets and heightened ambitions. And I think a lot of the ideas and initiatives that were described here can feed into that. So we will end it there. Thank you so much, Dixon, Sheila, Tapiwa, Bupe, Damien, for joining us, and of course for all the work that you guys are doing and the leadership that you're providing in many different ways. Thanks for everyone who joined us from around the world, and also for all the great questions. Tried to incorporate some of those into a bit of the discussion, and a lot of them were answered, I know, by the panelists in the chat. As I said, we'll make a recording available, and probably a few excerpts for shorter form, so feel free to circulate that, and continue to feed into the learning and thinking and practice that we're all doing. And lastly, just thanks to the rest of the Mali Asili team, everyone working behind the scenes to keep things running smoothly, respond to a lot of the questions in the chat, and make this happen. So thank you for joining us, and sign off.
Thanks,
Bye.
Fred.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.
Good. Cheers.
Yes.